Morning. Welcome to AMI Day 17. Today we're going to be considering the legal background and legal basis for segregation in the United States. So our big central question for the day is, what are the consequences of dividing people by race? Spoiler alert, there are consequences. So we want to think about, how did segregation begin? Did it begin with law? Did it begin with custom? And how is segregation linked to race and racism? So over the next few AMI days, we're going to be exploring the history of segregation and the different ways that it's affected American life. In 1865, in the final days of the Civil War, Congress approved an amendment abolishing slavery in the United States. Once the war ended, each Confederate state had to approve the 13th Amendment before it could return to its place in the Union. The newly readmitted states were willing to abolish slavery, but were not willing to accept African Americans as equals. State after state in the former Confederacy passed the so-called Black Codes, laws that tried to limit the freedoms of former slaves. The codes also spelled out what work African Americans would be allowed to do, and they also placed limits on the rights of African Americans. Congress responded to the Black Codes with a series of laws jointly known as Reconstruction. These laws placed the former Confederate states under military rule and set requirements for readmission to the Union, including approval not only of the 13th Amendment, but also the 14th and the 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment grants U.S. citizenship to all former slaves and declares that all citizens have the same rights and privileges. The amendment passed Congress on June 13, 1866, and was ratified on July 9, 1868. The 15th Amendment ensured that a citizen's race, color, or prior history as a slave could not be used to keep that individual from voting. Congress passed the amendment on February 26, 1869, and it was ratified on February 3, 1870. Despite the three amendments, the rights of African Americans were under attack almost everywhere in the nation in the late 19th century. For example, in 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed discrimination, was unconstitutional because it violated the rights of businesses, institutions, and civic organizations to choose customers, employees, and/or members. The justices claimed that the 14th Amendment applied only to state governments. A few years later, an African American from Louisiana named Homer Plessy challenged segregation on streetcars. He claimed that segregation violated his rights as a citizen of the United States. In 1896, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Mr. Plessy. 8 of the 9 justices argued that separate facilities for African Americans did not violate their rights as long as those facilities are equal to those provided for white Americans. Only one justice disagreed. In his dissent, John Marshall Harlan, a former slaveholder from Kentucky, wrote, "In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, are involved." Nearly 60 years would pass before the Supreme Court heeded Harlan's words. So for today's work, I'm going to have you interpret some amendments to the U.S. Constitution, specifically the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And I'll be challenging you to create headlines announcing the ratification of each of these amendments. So exercise your creativity a little bit for that activity. Our next step then will be to looking at the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And I want you to really think about how you think this case should have been decided versus how it actually was decided. It's entirely up to you. And then we'll close with a little bit of reflection. I want you to think about some really big ideas for American law and American culture even, right? What does created equal actually mean? Okay, so as ever, I'll encourage you to be introspective and reflective and do your very best, and send me an email if you need help.